Every single day, people take so many decisions, but are we aware of what's driving us to do so? Motivation plays a big part in why we do the things we do, and most of the time, we don't know why we're doing this because we don't really need a reason in order to keep making decisions. But understanding our motivation can play a key part in changing behaviors that might be detrimental to ourselves and others when we look at these more closely. I'm Rania Dubé, and welcome to How to Be Less of an Asshole, a channel where self-awareness is the only answer to our problems. This podcast aims to look at human behavior through the lens of history to better understand why we've become the people we are today, with hopes of inspiring you to do the same. In today's episode, I'll be talking with my friend Kirsten about how we can all become aware of our motivation. How did you become aware of motivation?
You know how your parents have certain little phrases that they use over and over again as a child? And one of the things that my mom would say often to us was to think before we speak. I think I heard that one thousands of times when I was a child. And another one that she would say fairly regularly was to treat people how you like to be treated. And so I think the think before you speak thing became a bit of a habit because she reminded me of it on a weekly, if not daily, schedule. So I would think about how my actions were going to play out. And, maybe sometimes to my own detriment. It might have inhibited my throat chakra, or there may have been some things that went undone and went unsaid because of that probably would have been healthy things to express. But both my parents are British, so we definitely have that repress and suppress thing going on for sure. But that, I think, as a child, that idea of considering the repercussions of my words and actions before doing them was something that was probably the beginning of subconsciously understanding motivation. My mom is a very kind person, and she, I think, did a pretty good job of relaying that kindness to her children. And so I for sure lived in a little bit of a bubble about darkness. I didn't really understand the level of darkness that exists in our world here on Earth. Now, I was, as I mentioned earlier, was married for 15 years to a fellow who suffers with a lot of different types of addiction, and was raised by a mother who is, I believe, bipolar or manic. And so he struggles in a lot of ways with how his childhood went. And there's a lot of victimization and a lot of blaming that happens there. And so being in that relationship with a little bit of self-awareness, I recognized relatively early on that this relationship that I was committed to was a real opportunity for my own personal growth. And so as I witnessed his behavior with some level of objectivity and compassion, I was able to see that there was a lot of darkness inside there that he really struggled with. And I could see that his mom, from things that he shared with me about her, I could see that she had very manipulative tendencies, and he had a blind spot to how those manipulative tendencies had been passed down to him. He didn't recognize that in himself. And so I watched for it, and I saw that he believed his motivation was pure, and I could see places where it wasn't, which then had me start to question, because I learned through my teachers that people are a mirror for us, and that things that I saw in him that made me feel uncomfortable were an indication that those things were alive and well in myself. So as I watched his behavior, I started to look for where I was doing those things. And I started to see that sometimes when I felt like I wanted to control a situation or have control over a situation, I would use my words in a very subtle way to manipulate. I'll give you an example actually of something that I feel like I've recently started to get a handle on. So say, for instance, two people said something to me that was quite similar. And the thing that they were saying could be used to convince someone that their actions were inappropriate. So I might share with them that these people had told me this thing and that they should take this information into account. But rather than say there was two people, I might say there was five. So the thing happened, but I'm exaggerating it because I believe that what I'm trying to share with this person is valuable information for the betterment of the whole, and that they're going to take me more seriously if there was 5 examples, not 2. So that is manipulation. Although I believe that it's for the better good, I believe that my actions are rooted in the better good, I am manipulating the situation for my desired outcome by giving false information without having compassion for self, without having a certain level of self-awareness, without being able to look at it objectively, without wanting to know myself better. I would have kept that hidden from myself. I wouldn't have looked at that habit that I have and want to shift it and recognize that it's a mechanism of control. And it's a mechanism of manipulation. So I don't need to skew the truth. I don't need to manipulate in order to get my desired outcome if there is no desired outcome. If there's surrender to the flow, the natural flow of life, I don't need to convince anybody of anything. So I don't need to exaggerate a situation in order to contribute to my convincing.
So once you told me that everyone is manipulative, and when I saw this in myself, I realized that even some of the good things I was doing were being manipulative. And I found that a lot of my motivation was to get validation so that people would tap me on the back and tell me I was doing a good job, or it was manipulative in a way so that I could get people to do what I wanted them to do, even if it wasn't coming from a bad place. And like you said, it has to do with intention because a lot of the time we aren't even aware that we're doing this. Do you think it's something innate in us that we're naturally manipulative because it served a purpose in our survival? So for instance, women learn to manipulate men with the aim of keeping the lineage going?
I think it's one of the layers of conditioning. I think that we go through cycles in humanity, and that we have gone through a period where, as a whole species, we have a tremendous amount of shame, and that lack of truthfulness that is embedded in the manipulation is a way that we cope and that we compensate for the level of shame that we carry. And that we're coming into a time now of healing. So we've been through a long period of time of wounding, and now we're coming into a time of healing, of a great healing. And inside of that healing, we need to be able to see these things in order to go through this process of healing. And I believe that part of my ability to see these things in myself is just part of the natural evolution, that God has given me the opportunity to develop my resilience, and on purpose, so that I have the resilience that it takes now to be able to look at my own past actions and recognize that they're unhealthy. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's simply where I was then, and this is where I am now. And the work that I was doing back then was very rooted in this physical world. I didn't understand the value of personal work and spending time with my inner child and being able to look at these things. But life has dealt me a hand of cards that has very generously given me the opportunity to do those things. And I don't think that I'm unique in that. I think that we're all in that place together right now. And I'm lucky and blessed enough to have the skills to be here in this seat and to be, I understand this is rooted in ego and this is a label that I give myself, but I consider myself to be quite a bold person. And I have a willingness to participate and to engage. And I don't mind being vulnerable. In fact, I kind of like it in certain situations. And so I think that, I'm blessed to be able to take the role of student and teacher at the same time.
I listened to lots of stuff about the tribe and how compassion and love had to evolve in order for us to survive. So how do you think we got from evolving with others by learning to work with one another, developing all the great hormones to help us feel close to people, to then using each other to gain things we don't need? And I say this knowing that we're currently going back to our original state of being, which is collaborative at our core. But how do you think we lost our way and got to where we're at now?
Well, we certainly have developed a lot of technology, right? And in some ways, it looks like that technology is really useful. In other ways, it looks like it's really damaging. So, and then you also, you referred to biology. So we were created with the ability for our body to make dopamine and serotonin and oxytocin, and those things are an important aspect of how we evolved, why we evolved, the direction that we evolved in, and starting now with the study of biology, we're starting to be able to really understand how they impacted our direction and how they were useful to us when we were hunter-gatherers and when life was difficult in a very different way from how it's difficult now. And then how those hormones running through our body do different things now that life is difficult on a much more emotional level than it was on a physical level. When life was difficult on a physical level, we didn't really have time to focus on challenging emotions. We didn't really have time to be upset with our husband for not painting the ceiling because we lived in a cave and there was no such thing as paint, and we were more concerned about collecting berries. So a lot of the modern stresses were just not a thing when we were dealing with physical challenges. But we've evolved. And so the more we evolve, the more that shift goes away from physical to emotional. And our let's admit, for the most part, our physical needs are met without in excess. Our physical needs here in the Western world are met in excess. And if greed wasn't such a part of humanity, the physical needs of everybody on the planet would be met. And so you would think that once those physical needs are met, life would be easy breezy. But as we'll go back to the beginning of this conversation, we generate struggle. So we don't have that physical struggle anymore. So we generate emotional struggle. We create that. We cause that. We are the cause of that emotional struggle. And I don't believe in the idea anymore of good and bad. I don't believe that that's a bad thing. I believe that that is part of our process. It's part of the process that we are going through in our own personal and collective evolution. Because again, there's the idea of duality, right?
And it's the first time that there's no struggle and that we have to behave in consequence of this. And that struggle that was keeping us in line isn't there anymore. And we're kind of behaving badly because of it. But it is the first time in our whole existence that we have the opportunity to go, hey, we have everything that we want. And we could keep buying more, but wouldn't it be better to share with everyone?
So it's an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity for us to see something that's glaringly obvious in front of us. If we can stand in the seat of the witness, if we can be the seer, if we can be the observer, we can take that step back and we can see, oh, wow, it doesn't need to be like this.
Yeah, and it's weird that in the absence of struggle that we just create more problems for ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And a prime example in my life right now, so as I mentioned, I came out of a 15-year marriage with someone who was the relationship was a challenge for the whole time. And I'm in a new relationship that's about almost a year and a half now. And the fellow that I'm in this relationship with is one of the calmest and kindest people that I know. And so I'm taking the layers of conditioning off of this 15-year relationship where I walked on eggshells for pretty much the entire time, I'm watching myself, and thankfully I have a level of self-awareness that allows me to stop myself in my tracks, usually quite quickly, but I'm watching myself generate drama inside of this relationship that doesn't need to have drama in it, because let's just say because that's what I'm used to. And I'm used to fairly regular upheaval. And when there's no upheaval happening, because there isn't upheaval that happens with this man.
Yeah, it's conditioning.
I'm not quite sure what to do. And it feels a little bit weird. And so I catch myself being a little bit neurotic because I'm not sure how to be in a relationship that is calm and peaceful.
Yeah, it's like, how do we not fight with each other or fight for land?
How do we settle? How do we relax? How do we just enjoy each other's presence?
When I was writing the questions, it made me realize that sadness is slowly leaving my life and that I'm going to really miss it. And I was like, who misses being sad?
Well, again, let's come back to the biology. Let's come back to those hormones that are in the body, right? So just like we can have addiction to caffeine, we can have addiction to dopamine, we can have an addiction to serotonin.
Well, we definitely have an addiction to dopamine because of social media.
Yeah, right? And so that sadness, when we experience thoughts that cause emotions, that cause a release of hormones in our body, we have a go-to. We have one that's our predominant one. And we, whether we like it or not, there's an addiction to that thing. And so sadness, as it starts to dissipate because your whole system is evolving, there's a self-aware part of you that recognizes, I miss that thing even though I don't really like it. Because there's a chemical release that happens in your body that you're addicted to. And that's normal. That's for every single one of us.
So I guess that's why we're attracted to things that aren't good for us.
Yeah, and we recreate. Oftentimes there's one particular traumatic incident as a child that's probably near the beginning of our memory. We recreate things in our lives to be able to duplicate that. Mine very clearly. When I was 3, I had bacterial meningitis, and I had to stay at the hospital for a couple of weeks because I was on a elephant-sized dose of antibiotics that had to be put into my body through an IV drip. And I hadn't been separated from my mom at that point in my life. And we lived about an hour away from the hospital, and I have 2 older brothers. My mom had to stay at home with them. And so I was in the hospital by myself for 2 weeks, and my parents would come down for about an hour in the evening each day. And the first memory of my life, I was in a crib in a hospital room. And at home, I didn't sleep in a crib because I was 3. So I was out of a crib and into a regular bed. And so I felt very much like I was a hostage. And I could hear that my mom had arrived. She was out in the hall speaking to the nurse. And over a period of time, I went from concerned that she wasn't coming in to absolutely hysterical. And my view is from the ceiling. So I have left my body because I am so hysterical. And I'm looking down on this hospital room. I could describe it to you to a T right now. And I'm in hysterics. And so I suffer from separation anxiety. And then earlier, again, in this conversation, I told you that I was in a 15-year relationship that came to an end 60 times in those 15 years. And so I recreated a situation where I got to experience separation anxiety every 3 months, a severe case of separation anxiety every 3 months for 15 years.
Did your parents speak to you about it? Like, as in ask you how you felt about staying at the hospital?
So again, at the time I was 3, and the impact of that, if the impact for them was 10, the impact for me was 1,000. And so I don't know that they even realize that there's anything to talk about.
I just asked this because I think it's weird how society assumes that kids don't know what's going on. And I've told my parents stories about when I was in diapers, and my dad couldn't believe that I remembered those things. And when I was 4, my grandmother died and I started crying hysterically at the church because I knew she was in the casket and that I would never see her again. But my father thought I was just throwing a tantrum. And when we talked about it later, I told him that I was crying because I knew she was gone, but he thought I was too small to understand what was going on.
Yeah, and I mean, for my parents, obviously, it was very traumatic. That there was a good chance that they were going to lose me. And so they were going through their own stresses of all of that. And I'm sure it was difficult for my mom to make the choice that she felt she needed to make to not be with me. And for me, I'm sure that I had a fever of 106 for way too long. So I'm sure as a 3-year-old child, I wholly did not understand what was happening to my body. I felt absolutely horrible. Felt like I was on fire. I felt like I was dying. I didn't know what death was. And on top of that, the umbilical cord had been severed. I had literally never been away from my mom before. And then I spent 2 weeks hysterical as to when is this going to end? How is this going to end? I don't have the communication skills to be able to understand what's happening here.
Yeah, I always had this preconception that there needs to be really apparent turmoil for there to be a cause for trauma.
So interestingly enough to that story, I'm going to refer back to my experience of Vipassana again. I had a major breakdown when I was at Vipassana. In one of the meditations, I was crying so much, and you have to do it quietly because you're in a room of 100 people that are meditating, that I had snot actually running, my face was covered in tears and I had snot actually running out of my nose and dripping off my chin. And thankfully it was in one of the meditations where you could get up and go to the washroom. So I went to the washroom and I cleaned my face and got myself settled, and then went back. And as soon as I sat down in my chair, it started all over again. And that's the second time I just let it happen. I just sat there for another 45 minutes with snot running off my face. And it was because these emotions were generated because in that hour-long meditation, I realized my mom was, she was born 3 months premature. And she was 3 pounds when she was born. She dropped down to 2.5 pounds before she started to gain weight again. And so she spent the first months of her life in an incubator in the hospital, not with her mother. And her mom would come there to see her, but my mom has older siblings. And so in my past, I felt very victimized that this happened to me. And while I was sitting in Vipassana, I realized that my experience of separation anxiety is nothing like my mom, who was born into seclusion for much, much longer than, I think it was months before they released her from the hospital and she was allowed to go home and be with her family and be with her mother. And it was necessary, or they believed that in 1950 that it was necessary for her to be there in an incubator for her to survive. And my mom is one of the strongest people that I know. And she had to be to make it past that initial part of her life where she started to thrive. And it took a while for her to start to thrive. So she started out in this world all by herself.
So if you could give anyone a tip on understanding and approaching motivation to make sure it's something that everyone is aware of every day, what would you say?
Be gentle on yourself. Recognize that you're not alone, that we all have the saint and the axe murderer in us and everything in between. We all have the capacity to behave really well, and we all have the capacity to behave really badly. And if our behavior is primarily all good, it's not because we've always been like that. It's because we've worked through the other stuff already. And so someone who has that primarily good behavior doesn't judge the person who has primarily bad behavior because they know that that's where they come from. And so there's support around us. When the student is ready, the teacher will come. So if we know that we're all in this together and that we all do these things, then we can be a little bit more gentle on ourselves and meet ourselves where we're at. Find a way to make it a habit to look at your motivation And although journaling is not, in the moment, it's still an opportunity to reflect on something that same day or that same week and address it when it's fresh and new. And then it becomes more of a habit. And journaling can be the beginning of the process, but there has to be a beginning to the process.
Thanks for taking the time to listen. And next time you have to take a decision, ask yourself if your motivation is based on outwards approvals or outcomes from others. Doing so will eventually move your motivation towards things that rely on your own personal approval instead of it coming from others around you. We'd like to thank the Pretties for providing the music for the podcast. And until next time, please remember, kindness is contagious.